Okay, good day class. So for today, we're going to discuss about the first topic of the finals, which is the cross-sectional study, analytic study design. Okay, and before we proceed, um, I'll just give you the learning outcomes or the objectives of today's discussion. So at the end of the discussion, the students, shall be able to first classify analytic study designs by answering three basic questions. Number 2, describe a cross-sectional study and its uses. The third one, given a set of data, compute and interpret the following: prevalence proportion and the prevalence ratio or the prevalence difference. So basically, right now you can now pause the video and then prepare your calculators kasi magka-calculate na naman tayo for today. Okay? Number 4, discuss the strengths and limitations of a cross-sectional study. Now, how do we classify analytic study design? So before we proceed to our main topic, which is the cross-sectional study, okay, let us just give a quick introduction on how do we classify or compare and contrast the different analytic study designs. Okay, so again, you just answer the three basic questions. The first question is, are you measuring the exposure and outcome variables at one time point? So basically, all of these three questions, yes or no lang ang sasagutin mo, and then you can already know or pinpoint which analytic study design you're going to utilize. Okay? So number 2, are you following up for the outcome variable? And number 3, are you assigning or manipulating the exposure variable? Okay? Okay, now, first question, sabi niya, are you measuring the exposure and outcome variables at one time point? So if your answer is yes, that is our main topic for today, cross-sectional analytic study design. So bakit yes? Because you are just looking at a snapshot, no? You're not doing any follow-up. Walang matagal na observation of the variables, no, involved. So basically, you're just going to look at the readily available data. Okay? Kaya nga, the other name of cross-sectional was prevalence, right? Since we have already discussed it in the descriptive, you are also going to apply analytic methods on measuring or testing your hypothesis. Hence, yung cross-sectional study. Okay? So, dito, if you're going to look at our table, since sa left, okay, on a single time point, okay, so time 0, ayan, time 0, mapapansin nyo, there is already the with exposure, without exposure, and then with outcome, and without outcome. Nandito na rin sa without exposure, yung with outcome, and without outcome. So, all of this happened at a single point in time. Okay? So, walang follow-up, walang mahabang observational period. Okay? Again, are you measuring the exposure and outcome variables at one time point? If your answer is yes, that means you're going to use cross-sectional study design. If your answer naman is no, you're going to use a different study design. We call this longitudinal. Okay? It will also be discussed in another topic, which is the cohort. Okay? So for now, we call this a longitudinal study. Longitudinal, nasa pangalan niya mismo, in the name itself, long, that means there's what we call an observation timeline. Okay? So, if you're going to look at the picture on the right side, yung E+, which is yung with exposure, yung time 0, dun ka palang mag-start. So, observe mo yung mga at-risk population na exposed and those population din, at-risk population that are unexposed. Okay? Dun sa time 0. And then, you go back after a few observation period, no? Magtatagal ka ng konti, and then, again, check mo yung observation after that. Okay? Kung anong nangyaring outcome sa kanila. So dun sa with exposure, check mo after your observation period if nagkaroon ba ng outcome, with outcome, or walang nangyari sa kanya without outcome. Same goes dun sa nangyari dun sa without exposure. Okay? After a long period of observation time, babalikan mo, and then you assess if it is kung meron siyang outcome, with outcome, or without outcome. Again, the difference, emphasize lang natin, no? Take note that if you're going to measure the exposure and outcome variables at a single or a one-time point, you're going to utilize a cross-sectional study design. Okay? Now, meron din tayong second question. Are you following up for the outcome variable? Okay, so these two types of longitudinal study designs. Okay, so in other books, in other books, they classify this as two types of longitudinal study design. In other references naman, they are separate. Okay. Nevertheless, important that you understand each of this. Okay? So again, the question was, are you following up for the outcome variable? If your answer is yes, okay, ibig sabihin at the time 0, imagine niyo, if it is today, check natin yung mga exposed group as well as the unexposed group, and then after, sabihin natin next year, so after next year, check natin, babalikan natin sila. Tingnan natin yung exposed group if there is an outcome or without outcome. Then, we go also to the unexposed group and then check natin if there's an outcome or without an outcome. So, that is what we call prospective. Okay? Kasi babalikan natin sila after a follow-up period. Yung isa naman is the retrospective. So, if your answer dito sa question ito is no, ang gagawin mo is retrospective. In the retrospective naman, yung time 0 mo, okay, instead of exposure, ang time 0 mo is with outcome and without outcome. Okay? Yung may nangyari na, kumbaga, may nangyari na dun sa population mo. Meron ng outcome and meron ng without outcome. Now, you just go back in time. Okay? Sir, paano yun? Wala namang time machine, di ba? So, paano natin kukunin yung history of this certain group of sample or at-risk population? Again, we go back to our topic dun sa midterms, which is yung collection ng data or yung sources of data, di ba? So, you go back in time using the data sources. So, pwedeng yung mga medical history, yung kanilang mga hospital records, no? Yung ano pa ba? Yung mga civil registry, census, etc. Okay? So, dito, you just go back in time using available resources. And then assess if they are exposed, no? If back then they were exposed or unexposed of a particular variable. No? So, yun. So, again, pag nagpo-follow up ka, prospective, if yung time time 0 mo is exposed or unexposed, and then you go back after a observation period Then, assess mo yung kanilang outcome. Pag retrospective naman, meron ng outcome agad. There's already an outcome, and then you go back in time using data sources. And then, assess if they are exposed or unexposed. Pwede mo rin pala sa interview. Interview or survey questions. Pwede rin doon. Okay? Next. Okay, the third question is, are you assigning or manipulating the exposure variable? So, dito naman, if your answer is yes, that means that you're going to conduct an experimental study. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, you as the researcher, you are free to manipulate or edit your sample data, no? Kung sila ba ay ma-expose or unexposed. Okay? So, paano natin ginagawa yan? So, usually, this is done by the scientists, mga pharmacists, no? Mga medical technologists, no? Ginagawa nila yung experimental study design. Kunwari, meron kang sample. Okay? Yung sample mo is a drug to treat ano ba magandang drug? A drug to treat dengue. Okay? A drug to treat dengue. So, meron kang exposed group. That means, bibigyan mo sila ng drug, no? Yung experimental drug mo for dengue. On the other hand, yung unexposed group, this will be considered as your control group, no? Bibigyan mo sila ng placebo drug or wala silang drug at all. Okay? So, ganun lang yun. Since you can manipulate the exposure variable, pwede mong piliin sino yung mga sample mo for that particular drug trial. Okay? And then again, after observation period, babalikan mo sila if there's an outcome. Effective ba yung drug na ginawa mo? Or there's no outcome, no? Walang effect. Check mo rin nun yung unexposed group if there's an outcome or there's no outcome. Okay? Now, this is what we call experimental. If your answer naman dito is no, that is what we call observational. So basically, all of the study designs na diniscuss natin from descriptive hanggang cross-sectional hanggang basta bago mag-experimental, lahat yun, they are all considered as observational because you can control the exposure group, no? You cannot manipulate them. Okay? Now, a quick review of our epidemiologic study designs. Again, meron tayong descriptive and analytic. No? Paulit-ulit tayo. So, pag descriptive, you describe the disease occurrence as to person, time, and place. Pag naman analytic, we examine association between variables. So, the descriptive, meron tayong case report, case series, ecologic study, as well as yung prevalence study or the cross-sectional study design. On the other hand, sa analytic, we have the cross-sectional study, cohort, case control study, and experimental study. Ang goal of descriptive is to generate hypothesis. Analytic naman is to test hypothesis. Now, baka may question kayo. Sir, bakit nung descriptive, diniscuss na natin yung cross-sectional as the prevalence study? So, why do we have to study it once again in the analytic study design? So, to answer that, prevalence study has both descriptive side of it and then meron din siyang analytic side of it. Yung descriptive side of the prevalence study is for you to understand or to describe, to give a concrete description na nangyayari doon sa na-generate mong hypothesis. No? Nagbibigay ka lang ng description towards your variables. Okay? Whereas sa analytic, meron na tayong gagawing analysis of data. Okay? So, paano natin ginagawa yan? So, we do that using measures of disease frequency and association. So, basically, papasok na naman dito yung mga ginawa natin nung midterms, which are yung ratio, yung proportion, and etc. So, ganun lang kasimple yun. Okay? So, we're just going to apply yung mga natutunan natin ng midterms and then gagamitin natin dito, and that's what we call analysis. Now, what is a cross-sectional study? So, this is a study design wherein all measurements of exposure and outcome are made up about the same time with no follow-up. Okay? So, basically, yung gagawin nating calculation, they are all a picture, no? It is a snapshot, no, of the exposure and outcome at a particular point in time. Walang follow-up, walang mahabang observation period. Okay? Next, exposure and disease status are measured at one point in time over a short period of time. And it provides a snapshot of the health experience of the population at a specified time. Okay, just to quick comparison of cross-sectional study design to the other analytic study designs. So, other analytic study designs, sabi nga natin kanina, no, dun sa classifying analytic study designs, the exposure and yung mga with exposed at saka yung without exposure, magkakaroon ka ng observation period or yung follow-up period, no? And then after that follow-up period, babalikan mo sila to assess if there's an outcome or if there's no outcome of a particular disease. So in this case, kunwari, smoking and lung disease. So other study designs, dun sa time zero mo, dun sa baseline time mo, no? Dun sa pinakauna, time zero, check mo yung mga nag-i-smoke at saka yung mga non-smokers. And then, babalikan mo sila after the follow-up period, after a few months, after a few years, no? Babalikan mo sila. And then, you assess kung sino yung mga nag-develop ng lung disease and sino yung mga hindi. Okay, so, merong matagal na observation period between the exposure as well as the outcome. Whereas naman kapag cross-sectional, you have your exposed group, yung mga nag-i-smoke, and then unexposed group, yung mga non-smokers, and then assess mo kung sino sa kanila yung currently meron ng lung disease, and then sino rin yung walang lung disease. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, a single point in time. Kaya nga ina-emphasize natin dun sa previous slide, di ba? Snapshot and short period of time, one time point. So, talagang a single point in time lang siya. Okay? Now, next, what are the steps in conducting a cross-sectional study? So, we have a few steps lang. Okay? So, steps in conducting a cross-sectional study. Number one, syempre, you define the study population. Make sure na yung study population mo is relevant to what you are trying to research or to test your hypothesis with, diba? So, dapat relevant siya doon sa target mo. So, yun yung target population mo. Second one, you recruit the sample from the study population. So, you get your sample. So, and then, assess mo if your sample is exposed or unexposed, no? assess mo if they are exposed na may disease, or unexposed na walang disease, or unexposed na may disease, or unexposed without the disease. Okay? So, ayan. Dito pala siya. Okay, sorry. Ayan, no? So, we have 4 groups that are possible. And ito yung sinasabi ko. Exposed that have the disease. Exposed that do not have the disease. Not exposed but have the disease outcome. And not exposed and does not have the disease outcome. Okay? So, those will be your groups, 4 groups. No? Recruit a sample from the study population. And then the third one is to measure the exposure and outcome of interest. So basically here you're trying to identify na what you're trying to test, no? Kung ano man yung hypothesis mo, you now try to calculate it or measure it. Okay? And then lastly, number 4, compute for measures of disease or yung exposure, disease frequency, and association. So basically, yan yung calculation, yung main calculation na gagawin natin later on. So that is your prevalence, no? Prevalence proportion, difference, etc. Now, I'll give you a scenario. Okay? So, yung hypothesis mo was association of smoking to lung cancer. No? Ganun lang kasimple. Then, syempre, yung exposure, you identify your exposure. What is your exposure? Smoking. What is the outcome? Lung cancer. And then the first one, syempre, define the study population. And then you identify kung sino kaya yung mga mahilig mag-smoke na population or community. So, ito, nakita niya, baka yung mga BPO or yung mga corporate employees, no? Because they are usually stressed out. So, basically, they are at risk of smoking, no? Sila yung madalas na nag-i-smoke. Okay? So, now, kunwari sila yun. Okay? So, number 2, you recruit a sample from the study population. Now, you identify kung sino yung mga smokers dito, and then sino yung mga non-smokers. Okay? And third one, syempre, you measure exposure and outcome of interest. So, how do you measure exposure and outcome of interest? So, you assess yung kanilang or evaluate through questionnaires, check their medical health records, no? Physical measurements, or pwede rin laboratory examination. Okay? To assess if they are really smokers or non-smokers, and if they have developed lung cancer or they are healthy. Okay? Now, these are the important considerations when measuring exposure and outcome of interest. So, when measuring exposures of interest, determine how long and when the exposure occurred. So, bakit? Because it provides an opportunity to relate the time of exposure to the time of the disease onset. Okay? So, what if kasi, kailangan mo talagang gawin to. What if that particular disease outcome is nangyari prior the exposure, no? Nauna siyang nagka-lung cancer bago pa siya nag-smoke, di ba? So, baka kasi ganun yun, no? Or what if kakasmoke niya lang 1 week ago, okay? And then yung diagnosis niya of the lung cancer happened just yesterday. So, you need to determine that as well. Okay? And the next one, when measuring outcomes of interest, time of onset of first symptoms of disease should be determined whenever possible. For diseases with periods of exacerbations and remissions, it is important to ask asymptomatic individuals at the time of the study whether they have had such symptoms in the past. So, basically, you need to have a thorough investigation and thorough research regarding that particular disease outcome. Kasi every individual is unique, di ba? So basically, baka yung nangyaring disease remission dito, baka nagkaroon pala siya ng remission of that particular disease. No? Hindi lang natin alam. Nagka-lung cancer siya, natanggal, and then bumalik lang yung lung cancer niya. Okay? Or what if nagka-lung cancer siya dati, and then natanggal yung tumor, okay, gumaling siya, nag-study ka at this particular point wherein gumaling na siya, and then after a few years, no, tapos na yung study mo, nag-remit, no, bumalik yung kanyang lung cancer. So basically, it's really difficult. So kailangan talaga you have a thorough research of your disease outcome, as well as syempre pati na rin yung exposure mo tsaka yung at-risk population mo. And then lastly, diagnostic criteria need to be established in advance. Okay? So kailangan you have a specific or you have a concrete and you have a concrete you have a concrete, you have a specific, you have an efficient and effective criteria, no? Whenever you're trying to choose your sample population, dapat perfect, no, or near perfect yung inyong inclusive tsaka exclusion na criteria. Now, prepare your calculators na. No? So, this will be our measure of disease frequency at saka yung measure of disease association. So, we have the prevalence proportion, okay, and then the prevalence ratio, saka yung prevalence difference. So, take note that para mapadali or for you to have an easy computation or di ka malito, ganito lang ang lagi nyong gagawin. So, you have a table, no? Dalawa, and then lagyan nyo ng A, B, C, and D. Tapos make sure na nasa taas yung disease, tapos without disease, okay, or yung outcome with outcome, tsaka yung without outcome, tapos exposed tsaka unexposed, no? So ganun lang kasimple yan. So dapat laging ganyan yung magiging table nyo, and then you just include or just put A, B, C, and D. Okay? So ganyan lang yan. The next one is calculate the prevalence of the disease in exposed compared to non-exposed persons. So, again, calculate lang natin yan. So, how do we calculate the prevalence of disease? Again, di ba dapat naka-label na yan ng A, B, C, D. So, yung A mo, which is your disease that are exposed individuals na may disease outcome, okay, yan yung numerator, and then yung baba niya, syempre, yung subset nun, yung exposed na may disease outcome, tsaka yung without outcome, no? Versus C over C plus D. So, dito naman, yung numerator mo will be yung with the disease pero not exposed, and then ang denominator mo would be C plus D. So, yung mga not exposed na may disease tsaka without the disease outcome. That is the prevalence of disease. Pag sinabi naman prevalence of exposure, babaliktarin mo lang. So, A over A plus C. So, instead of yung sa denominator mo would be the outcome, so, dito, ang gagamitin mo yung mga exposure na, no? Yung exposure. So, A plus C versus B over B plus D. Okay? Okay, so this will be the last step. Compute for measures of disease or exposure, frequency, and association. So, measures of disease, frequency, or exposure, frequency, and association. Yan. Again, gawin mo lang yung table. Nasa taas yung disease outcome, tsaka walang disease outcome. Then, nasa left side yung exposure, tsaka yung not exposed. Okay? Tapos A, B, C, D. Yan. Yan. Ganyan lang, no? Nawala to. Disease. Negative. Yan. So, with the disease, walang disease. Exposed, not exposed. Yan. So, prevalence of disease, yung may with the disease outcome with the exposed group. Okay? So, A over A plus B. Pag prevalence naman of the diseased individuals, no? Yung mga positive with the disease outcome in the unexposed group, C over C plus D. Okay? Now, the prevalence ratio, okay? So, prevalence ratio naman is you just divide yung dalawang sinolve mo. So, again, if yung hinahanap natin is yung proportion ng mga may sakit or disease or disease outcome, ibig sabihin, yung numerator mo, yung nakalculate mo dun sa prevalence of the positive disease in with exposure, tapos over, yung denominator mo would be yung nakalculate mo dun sa prevalence of with disease in unexposed group. Okay? So, ganun lang siya kasimple. Tapos, huwag kayong papalito if if yung kinukuha naman na prevalence ratio would be the prevalence of the exposed individuals or exposed group, no? Yung mga may positive in exposure. So, basically, magbabago lang ng konti yung magiging numerator and denominator mo. So, instead of this one, ang gagamitin mo is ito niyan. Okay? So, ganun lang kasimple yan. Now, meron din tayong tinatawag na prevalence difference. So, dito naman, you just, instead of dividing them, you're just going to subtract the two calculated values. Okay, now, given this set of data, ano kasing exposure natin? That would be smoking. And then, yung outcome niya is COPD. Okay? So, ayan. So, ngayon, you just analyze muna yung data mo. Okay? I-analyze mo muna. So, gagawa tayo ng table. So, alamin mo kung nasan yung disease or yung disease outcome, tsaka yung exposed group, tsaka non-exposed group. So, ano ba yung exposure natin? That would be smoking. So, this is the exposure. So, they are smoking, ibig sabihin, meron siyang positive exposure. They are exposed. And then, yung mga yung mga non-smokers, they are unexposed. Okay. The disease outcome naman would be with COPD and without COPD. So, this will be positive disease and then negative disease. So, ngayon, assess mo yung table mo. If this is the correct one, if this is the correct one, again, lalagay mo lang A, B, C, and D. So, meron ka ng complete table. No? Madali ka na lang nun magka-calculate. Okay? And then, syempre, meron na rin silang mga total. Okay? Para at least, mas madali na yung calculation of the proportion. Now, yung question niya is prevalence of disease in exposed. Okay? In prevalence of disease in exposed. Okay, so paano kaya yan? So, madali lang yan. Okay, I'll give you 5 seconds to try to analyze it and then continue na tayo. Okay, so ganito yung sagot niyan. So, the prevalence of with disease tsaka exposed. Okay, so ibig sabihin dito tsaka dito. So, A over A plus B. So, paano kaya yun? 200 over 200 plus 100, which is the 300, is equal to 0.67. So, dun pa lang, meron ka nang nakuhang or na-answer dun sa prevalence of disease in exposed. Now, you calculate naman dito prevalence of disease in unexposed. Again, with disease and unexposed. So, gagawin lang natin kanina, pero different numerator. Okay. 20 over 20 plus 180. Ayan. Tsaka denominator. Okay. Now, the prevalence of the positive disease in unexposed group would be 0.10. Okay, now, how do we interpret these numbers? So, meron ka ng prevalence of the disease in the exposed group. Meron ka rin prevalence of the disease in the unexposed group. O kaya, or pwede rin natin sabihin na prevalence of COPD in smokers tsaka prevalence of COPD in non-smokers. Okay? So, proportion is A plus AB is multiplied by the factor is equal to your prevalence proportion. So, multiply natin yan mga yan. Ayan. The prevalence proportion of COPD among smokers is 67%. Meanwhile, the prevalence proportion of COPD among non-smokers is 10%. Okay? Diba? Ganun lang siya kasimple. Okay, next we have the prevalence ratio. So, pag prevalence ratio naman, yung mga computed value natin earlier, okay, ang gagawin mo lang, you just divide them. So, 0.67, which is yung answer natin, dun sa with disease, tsaka na exposed group, tapos yung 0.10, which is your with disease and an exposed group. Okay, so divide mo lang sila. So, your prevalence ratio is 6.7. Diba? Ganun kasimple. Now, how do we interpret the prevalence ratio? So, dito naman so importante yung interpretation dito. So, if your prevalence ratio is equal to 1, okay, please take note of that, no? It is equal to 1, that means similar lang yung computed value mo dun sa numerator as well as the denominator. That means the interpretation is the prevalence of the disease is the same between exposed and unexposed group. Kapag naman more than 1 yung magiging computed value mo sa prevalence ratio, the interpretation would be the prevalence of the disease is kung ano yung value mo dun sa prevalence ratio times higher in the exposed group compared to the unexposed group. Okay? Or mas maganda, if you want a percentage na nasagot, the prevalence of the disease is yung na-computed value mo ng PR minus 1 multiplied by 100. So, magiging sagot mo nandito sa interpretation na to would be a percentage. Okay? Higher in the exposed group compared to the unexposed group. And then lastly, if your computed PR value is less than 1, that means the prevalence of the disease is, ang gagawin mo lang is 1 minus the PR, no, multiplied by 100. Okay? Lower in the exposed group compared to the unexposed group. So, balikan natin, ano ba yung computed value natin? 6.7, right? So, paano natin siya i-interpret? So, ganito siya. The prevalence of COPD is 6.7 times higher among smokers compared to non-smokers. Or, pwede mo rin gawin yung isa, which is yung percentage, 6.7 minus 1, which is 5.7 multiplied by 100, makukuha mo is 570%. So that means the prevalence of COPD is 570% higher among smokers compared to non-smokers. So ganun lang siya kasimple, no? Okay? That's it. Next, we have also the prevalence difference. Okay? So, dito naman, yung mga computed value natin kanina sa proportion, gagawin mo lang is subtract yung dalawa. Okay? So, 0.67 minus 0.10. So, the prevalence difference would be 0.57. Now, how do we interpret prevalence difference? So, prevalence difference kapag equal to 0, ibig sabihin, once again, yung mga values mo ay similar lang, hence, makukuha ka ng 0 value. So, the interpretation here is the prevalence of the disease is the same between the exposed group and unexposed group. If your prevalence difference naman is more than 0, okay, for every, kung ano yung multiplier mo, persons, there are blank or yung computed value mo ng prevalence difference, more cases of the disease in the exposed group compared to the unexposed group. Okay? Kapag naman less than 0, so nagkakaroon ka na ng negative values. So again, for every blank persons, there are blank fewer, or yung computed prevalence difference mo, fewer or less cases of the disease in the exposed group compared to the unexposed group. Now, sure, nakuha namin dito is negative value. So, pag minsan, kasi dito sa less than 0, yung usually, ang answer dyan would be 0 point something, ganun. However, there are few times na makukuha mong computed value mo would be sa prevalence difference would be negative value. So, pag ganun ba, ang sasagutin mo dito for example, for every 1,000 persons, there are negative 3 fewer or less cases of disease in it. Ganun bang sagot? The answer is no. Ang magiging sagot mo dyan is a positive value na. No? Kasi dito sa interpretation itself, nagiging positive value na yung computed value mo. So, instead of negative siya, for every 1,000 persons, there are 5 fewer or less cases of the disease in the exposed group compared to the unexposed group. In other references, they retain the negative value. However, magbabago yung interpretation mo. So, for the interpretation's sake, no, since ganito yung interpretation natin for the prevalence difference, ko-convert mo lang into a positive value yung computed mo negative value if your answer is negative dito sa less than 0. Okay? Now, prevalence difference is equal to 0.57. Now, 0.57 multiplied by 100 is equal to 57. Okay? So, sabi niya, for every 100 persons, there are 57 more cases of COPD among smokers than non-smokers. No? Kasi yung computed value mo is more than 0. Hence, ang gagamitin mo, yung pangalawang interpretation. Now for our last topic, uses, strengths, and limitations of cross-sectional study. So what are the uses of cross-sectional studies? The first one is to determine the magnitude of a disease. Second one is to generate hypotheses regarding disease etiology. And number 3, to evaluate medical care or health service delivery as a whole. And number 4, to establish a baseline data, which is the most important thing dito, no? Yung you are going to establish a baseline data for the future researchers na magamit nila, no? Magkaroon sila ng baseline data, and then yung from that particular baseline data na na-generate mo, mako-compare nila yung magagawa nilang future researches, no? Mako-compare nila if it is ganito pala talaga, similar yung magiging nakuha ng value, no? Ganun pala talaga yung ang prevalence ng ganitong particular disease, or what if mas mataas or mas mababa yung makukuha nilang data. That means nalalaman nila yung what are lacking on your baseline data, or kung ano man yung mga na-miss mo, mas nakuha nila on the future researches. So it is really important to establish baseline data. So other uses niya, the first one, to determine the magnitude of the disease. Yes, you assess on a particular or a single point in time lang, you assess the magnitude of that disease, no? Disease occurrence. Okay. Second one, syempre, to generate hypothesis, because once again, cross-sectional study is both descriptive and then analytic. So ang goal niya is to generate a hypothesis. At the same time, you test the particular generated hypothesis by measuring the disease association tsaka yung frequency. Okay? Tapos yung third one naman, to evaluate the medical care or health service delivery as a whole. Since you are targeting a single point in time, that means you can assess, no, yung nangyayaring medical care dun sa mga at-risk population na yun, if they regardless if they are exposed or unexposed on a particular disease outcome. Okay? Again, yung number 4, that is the main or the most important thing or use ng cross-sectional study, to establish a baseline data. Now, what are the strengths of cross-sectional studies? Number 1, can be carried out over a relatively short periods of time. Since the study itself is already existing, no? Di ba nga doon sa midterms topic natin of prevalence, when we talk about prevalence of a disease, that means the disease occurrence already existed. So you just go back in time through records, interviews, questionnaires, and health surveys, etc. No? Madali na lang siyang magagawa nun yung study mo. Okay, so it can be carried out over a relatively short period of time. And importante pa, there is no follow-up period. Second one, can be included as the first step in a cohort study or clinical trial with little or no added cost. Again, ito yung pinaka-importante. Earlier, ano ba yung sinabi ko kanina? Dun sa uses ng cross-sectional studies, yung pinaka-importante. Ang pinaka-importante is you establish a baseline data. Okay? That particular baseline data would serve as the first step in other analytical studies such as yung cohort, tsaka yung clinical trials, no, or yung experimental studies. And then, pwede rin siya for improved generalizability. Okay? Now, for the limitations of cross-sectional studies, yes, we have strengths of cross-sectional study, pero meron din siyang limitations similar to descriptive studies at saka sa mga future studies, no? Okay? The main limitation of cross-sectional study is what we call antecedent consequent bias. Okay? Ang tawag dito is antecedent consequent bias. So what does this bias means? So kung mapapansin nyo, it is really difficult to establish a cause and effect relationship between your exposure and outcome. Okay? Yes, you have already computed yung for example, yung kanina, yung relationship with the smokers, tsaka yung mga nag-develop na COPD. However, you cannot establish yung cause and effect ng dalawang yan. So, similarly, meron tayong chicken and egg problem. Which came first? The chicken or the egg? So katulad yan sa cross-sectional studies, mahirap mag-establish antecedent consequent bias. So, another example dito would be the obesity and diabetes. So, ang question mo dito, pag ba obese ba ang isang individual, magde-develop siya ng diabetes? Or, pag ba, ang lahat ba ng mga diabetic people are at risk na maging obese in the future? Diba? So, you cannot answer that since each individual, each of your population, no, each individual sa population or sa sample group mo are unique, no? So there is a case-to-case basis. Yes, may mga population na nag-develop ng diabetes because they are obese, no? Meron din namang mga obese person na walang diabetes. Meron din namang mga diabetic person na hindi naman obese. In fact, they are thin, no? So, napakahirap nung mag-establish ng cause and effect sa cross-sectional studies. Okay? The second one, it is impractical for the study of rare diseases. Okay? Since you are looking at a single point in time, you're just looking at a snapshot of the disease occurrence. May mga cases that are different from that stereotype, from that whole group. Okay? So, there are cases na iba. So, again, you'd go back to another analytical study or descriptive study design para magawa mo itong rare diseases na to. Okay? Which is yung case report, no? Tsaka yung case series. And lastly, it will always reflect determinants of survival as well as etiology. Ito din yung tinatawag nating survival bias. Survival bias. Okay? So, bakit survival bias? Because people who either recover or die from a disease quickly have less of a chance of being included in the disease group. So, what if yung gusto mong i-assess or i-compute na cross-sectional studies ay may kinalaman sa lung cancer, diba? So, on a single point in time, what if yung mga other lung cancer patients, no, namatay na sila, so they are not already included in your study, so bawas na yung mga may mga lung cancer, and then kung sino lang yung mga kunwari smoking and lung cancer again, no? Okay. So, yung mga nag-i-smoke tapos nag-develop ng lung cancer, nangamatay sila agad. Tapos yung ibang nag-i-smoke na natira, wala silang lung cancer. Tapos yung mga non-smokers, no, dahil hindi sila continuously nag-i-smoke, okay, second-hand smoking lang, they develop lung cancer, hindi pa sila namatay. So, basically, nung kinumpute mo yun, dahil mas marami pang buhay na smokers na walang lung cancer, that means yung prevalence ng lung cancer dun sa grupo na yun would be lower, no? Dun sa mga smokers na nagde-develop ng lung cancer, it would be lower prevalence because nga, namatay na yung ibang mga nagka-lung cancer. So, similarly, ganito din yung sa ibang topics, di ba? Sabihin nila, kasi yung buhay namin dati maganda, so kaya ito yung gusto ko, di ba? So, survival bias yun, tawag natin doon. Okay? Kasi yung iba na nahirapan yung panahon na yun, yung single point in time, namatay na sila. Okay? So, hindi mo na sila masasama dun sa survey na maganda ba yung buhay nun? Okay? Okay, pag yung survey niya, maganda ba yung buhay nun? Yung mga tinanong mo, yung mga nabuhay lang ng masaya, tapos yung mga mahihirap na nangamatay, hindi mo na sila matatanong, di ba? So, nagkakaroon ng survival bias. Okay? And then, I think that's it. Yes, that's it. So, these are our references. And then, okay, that's it. So, if you have any questions, don't be shy, just email me. Okay, so, again, thank you and God bless you always. Stay safe.